Hello, everyone. I'm Jacalyn Duffin of Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, but I'm coming to you from Lac-Mégantic, Quebec. Our session on breakthroughs in ethics is down to one speaker because we've had some dropouts. I'm very pleased to introduce my friend and colleague Cheryl Krasnick Warsh, who teaches at Vancouver Island University in Canada, the opposite side of the country. She teaches medical history, women's history, and cultural history. She's published on women's health, children's health, asylums, tobacco, alcohol, and drug use, and she has been the editor of the Canadian Bulletin of Medical History, which is a participant in this festival, for 13 years. She's currently co-editor of Gender in History and was elected to the Royal Society of Canada in 2017. Her latest book is a forthcoming biography of Frances Oldham Kelsey, another Canadian who is near and dear to this group, probably for saving the United States from thalidomide. This book is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. And one more anecdote that is relevant to her session today is that she has recently become a pet parent of a young Irish setter named Orion. Her title is Dr. Frances Kelsey and the Animals, a case study of the evolution of pharmacology in the 20th century. Cheryl.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I just want to make a correction. It's an Irish Terrier, who's an entirely different kettle of fish than an Irish setter, but lovable nevertheless. I just want to thank Kristen and Greg and Luke for doing all of this, because I know how challenging it is to put together a conference like this with all of the time zones and computer issues and the rest of it. And kudos for you for carrying on with this. I also am it's very bittersweet not to be there in Madison, which is a place I wanted to go ever since I started using the first edition of Sickness and Health in America, Levitt and Numbers, in, I believe, 1986, when there was just a handful of us teaching medical history in Canada, and using all of the editions ever since. My interest in this particular subject, when I was doing the research on Dr. Kelsey, was that on the one hand, she was such an animal lover. She would interrupt our interviews to look at squirrels out the window and comment on them. And on the other hand, she experimented on animals. And I got to start understanding that you really have to see this kind of pharmacology as almost akin to farming, in the sense that you have a close tie, you can have bonds with animals that you're then going to do all kinds of bad things to. And so anyway, so I'll carry on here. Frances, oh, I've got to get my slides going. Let's just see. Hopefully this all works. Here we go. Great. Okay, that's a good, there we go. Frances Oldham Kelsey, born on Vancouver Island, Canada, became one of the most famous women in the world in the early 1960s. So I just want to make sure, can you all see the slides?
No.
Okay, so I just thought of that maybe I'm not on the right thing. Just wait. Okay, let's try this one, right? Is it that one? Oh, there we go. Okay, now we do that. We all have to be very cool. It is not a terrible thing. Okay, how's that? Can you see that?
No.
You still can't see that. Okay, is Kristen still there? Okay, Kristen, can you get my slides back up?
I will put them up if I can. 1 sec.
Okay, we had it there 30 seconds ago. But okay, let's.
Can you hit the share button at the bottom again? I can't put them back up.
Oh, there we go. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, let's try that. Okay, are we there?
Yep, and then presentation mode, and we should be set.
Okay, we're good.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, you see, this is what I mean about getting too old for all this business. Okay. She became one of the most famous women in the world in the early 1960s when she was credited with preventing the sedative thalidomide from being unleashed onto the American market. Because of this action, the United States was spared the potentially thousands of cases of severely deformed babies that other nations, including Germany, United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, experienced. Before Dr. Kelsey began working at the FDA in 1960, she was an accomplished pharmacologist and a pioneering female scientist in an emerging field. Her chosen field, pharmacology, includes the study of how substances interact with the biological functions of animals before they are tested on humans. This was an activity fraught with controversy for centuries. By the second half of the 19th century, two opposing forces were evident. As experimental science provided the underpinnings for the medical revolution, this research was based upon an unprecedented reliance on the use of animals. At the same time, other segments of early industrial society began critiquing the practice. By the 20th century, countless advancements in medical research, including pharmaceuticals, radiation therapy, vaccines, and new surgical techniques, saved millions of lives, both human and animal, and significantly increased human life expectancy. Because of this, and assurances among researchers to avoid undue animal suffering, the anti-vivisectionists lost much of their popular support and interest. Another important factor in the diminishment of anti-vivisectionist support was the increasing use of rodents rather than dogs or horses as research material. Mice and rats associated with filth and the carrying of plagues did not evoke the same sympathy as Rin Tin Tin, Old Yeller, or the yearling, and the domesticated rat would be a favored species for genetic research. On the other hand, as Johns Hopkins pharmacologist Louis Lasagna would caution in 1962, the practice of some pharmaceutical firms to test drugs only on rodents was inadequate. He's saying all drugs should be tested on higher animals such as dogs, perhaps monkeys would be better. The use of animals was no minor aspect of drug research. In 1961 alone, it was estimated that some 9 million animals were used for experimental purposes by the pharmaceutical industry. Researchers had to be more sensitive and circumspect, not only in the care and treatment of the animals, but in their medical writings and publicity about their discoveries. This was first recognized by Francis Peyton Rouse, the editor of the Journal of Experimental Medicine, the leading organ in which Kelsey published several studies. Rouse actively massaged manuscripts, de-emphasizing the lab procedures and the numbers of animals used. The absence of such self-censorship was apparent in a study used by Kelsey in one of her editions of Essentials of Pharmacology, a textbook she co-wrote with her research supervisor, Eugene Geiling of the University of Chicago, and co-researcher and husband, Ellis Fremont Kelsey. In 1948, and this was a study used in the textbook, Dr. Abraham Wickler, research psychiatrist at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, was investigating the neurophysiological basis of morphine addiction through experimenting with dogs. He used electric shocks on the dog's hind legs to measure reactions based upon the dosages of morphine with which they were injected. What was disconcerting for the general reader was that he named the subjects so that Dusty displayed excited neurotic behavior, Blackie was more inhibited, and Gus was fairly stable. Perhaps Wickler was demonstrating that his team had an affectionate relationship with the research subjects. It read, however, as if Blackie, Dusty, Gus, and other household pets were being electrocuted, beaten up, and overdosed. For the most part, however, the public appreciated the contributions of medical science and was fascinated with the stories of medical advancements. A well-known early 20th century drama was the discovery of insulin by Frederick Banting and team. The Nobel Prize and other glory enjoyed by members of the Banting team was a tender subject for Guyling, who had been working on insulin since his days at Johns Hopkins. As he pointed out, this epoch-making discovery is but a milestone in a 250-year-old study concerned with the abnormal physiology of diabetes. But it was the Canadian group that crossed the finish line first, aided by their research with dogs. Guyling used sensitive language in his studies, which emphasized the reduction of unnecessary suffering. For instance, in one study, 3 female monkeys were anesthetized with Nembutal, supplemented with further injections when necessary. They were, quote, covered with toweling, and the operating table was slightly warmed from below with an incandescent light bulb. Not an unpleasant experience at Spa Guyling. Guyling's student and a close Kelsey friend, Julius Kuhn, similarly emphasized clinical trials that avoided undue suffering of the research subjects, in this case, the lowly chicken. Frances Kelsey was rather forthright in her language in her armadillo research published in 1938. She stated that the armadillos were, quote, killed with ether or stunned by electrocution. And I just have to show you this picture. I hope you look at it carefully. Only a few years later, the language used in her publications reflected heightened sensitivity to the controversies concerning vivisection. This is one of the very few armadillo ranches in America, the Apelt Armadillo Ranch, which advertise how, you notice how they make the quaint lampshades out of the armadillo shells, and they also advertise that they made very stylish purses. During the Second World War, Guyling's research team at the University of Chicago, along with many teams in the US and Australia, were commissioned by the American military in a desperate search for a cure for malaria. In one study, 26 rabbits, some pregnant, were, quote, sacrificed without anesthesia. To describe the animal deaths as sacrifices had respectful, regretful, and even biblical connotations, as if to emphasize that they were killed or rather gave their lives for a higher good, similar to the troops overseas. Such platitudes were not working in other laboratories on the Chicago campus. One of Ellis's letters to Frances in the summer of 1944 included this tidbit of faculty gossip. Lots of excitement. Herald American is putting on an intensive anti-vivisection campaign. Pictures of Femister's dog room et al. Libel suits, no dogs from the pound, big public hearing. Billings called the House of Horrors. The medical class is dismissed to pack the courtroom. Guyling down there too in a dither. William Randolph Hearst, who was the publisher of the Herald American, had campaigned against vivisection since 1913, and his views were spread nationally across his newspapers with headlines like, "These mournful waifs of the city," "Chamber of Horrors, 3 pets die in 3 minutes," and "Prophets make dog torture a big racket." The Chicago City Council got involved when an anti-vivisectionist lobby and an 11-year-old ordinance concerning unclaimed stray dogs. The ordinance stated that after a waiting period, stray dogs were to be destroyed or released for experimental purposes to the medical schools in the city. City Council's hearing became uproarious as the Chicago medical students, joined by 1,500 students from the other city universities, bedecked in Army and Navy uniforms, quote, took possession of the galleries, cheering and booing the aldermen who, Irishmen by definition or by temperament, when not by nativity, entered joyously into the spirit. The Hearst newspaper rival, the Chicago Daily News, supported medical research and stated the case for science. Yet the clinical investors were not without fault. The evidence, as presented in the Gleish report, was powerful and damning. Alan Gleish was a superintendent of the Illinois Citizens Animal Welfare League. He went undercover to find out what was going on in the university research labs. Gleish charged the university was given the largest number of our city pound dogs for vivisection, and that hundreds of dogs, man's best friend and most loyal companion, were subjected to almost unbelievable stench, filth, and suffering in a modern 20th century hospital. University President Robert Hutchins commissioned Dr. Alexander Brunsvig, a surgical oncologist on faculty, to rebut the Gleish report. Brunsvig admitted that in terms of the conditions of the kennel, much improvement could be made. The quote, starving dogs were part of an experiment conducted to document the effects of protein depletion by starvation. But the researchers noted that the dogs were freely given water. Gleish was working for Dr. Dallas Burton Phemister, who gave his name to several medical advancements and diagnoses, including the Phemister graft, a technique for transplanting bones, and the Phemister triad, referring to 3 identifying features of tubercular arthritis. In 1944, Dr. Phemister was under contract by the War Department to study shock, what caused it, and how to cure it. Brunsvig argued that the experiments look unnecessarily cruel to the layman. Although the dogs are under ether, the technique involves pounding a hind leg with a taped hammer until the dog dies. Shock conditions are induced by this method. Dr. Phemister has proved that blood plasma injections can prevent death from shock. His proofs are based on these experiments. The results are of tremendous value in war and in peace. Beating dogs to death, even under ether, even for the benefit of millions of enlisted men and women and non-combatants who are experiencing the atrocities of war without the use of anesthetics, was difficult to justify and a public relations nightmare for the university. Hence, university protocols for the ethical treatment of animals in research were born. The University of Chicago's administration admitted that the animal quarters were inadequate, and in August 1945 took definitive action. They shut down the filthy space at Billings and installed dog kennels capable of housing and feeding 200 animals at a rural rental property, Moser Farm in Glenview, Illinois, to be known as the Toxicity Laboratory Dog Farm. The cynic might say that this action moved the animals away from the prying eyes of critics. On the other hand, the dogs got the opportunity to frolic and bark in the fresh air, perhaps chase a rabbit or two, before being carted back to the laboratories to do their bit for medical research. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. The floor is open for questions, and I'm just checking the chat. And since the group isn't very large, perhaps you can unmute yourself and ask questions of Cheryl directly. While you're gathering your thoughts, maybe I can ask a question. Cheryl, did Frances Kelsey keep animals herself?
Looks like Cheryl's internet connection is a little spotty right now.
Uh-oh. Is she back? Cheryl, are you there? Oh, no.
Well,
Come in, Cheryl. Quebec to British Columbia. This is quite odd. Kristen, what do you suggest is going on?
I think it's just a temporary glitch, like Luke said, and if somebody else has a,
Oh, we've got a question from Erica. So,
it looked like Cheryl is trying to come back in too, so she may had to drop out and come back. So, Cheryl, can you hear us? You're muted. Let me unmute you.
Hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. All right.
yay.
Okay. I'm going to see if I can get my video back, but I think he's saying I'm still recording on the old one, so I may not be able to be videoed.
Oh,
Okay, well, you can ask the question.
okay. Well, we have a question from Erica
Okay. Hi.
in the chat box, but I'll read it. What did Frances Kelsey see as her legacy in this field? Is it more related to thalidomide, as some see her, or her work on animal welfare?
She saw her work on animal welfare as always subsumed under her research on pharmacology. So thalidomide was one important aspect of her work, but she was actually in the FDA for over 40 years. And so it became the breakout thing for her, thalidomide, but she saw herself as a practicing pharmacologist and then as an administrator. So, yeah, she enjoyed working with the animals, but then by the time she was there at the FDA, she was an administrator and she was no longer actually actively working with animals.
Luke has asked if you could say a bit more about your Water Book project and your interviews with Dr. Kelsey.
Okay, I'm just trying to see if there's any way I can get my video working again.
Cheryl, I did kick the other you out, so if you are able to click on the video button, it might work.
Okay, let's try again. We can't connect it. Okay, all right. Okay, well, thank you for asking about that. This was an 8-year project. The thing about Dr. Kelsey, as I mentioned, she worked in the FDA for 40 years, and she was a pack rat, and so that she still had material from when she was in nursery school all the way up to her 100th birthday celebration. Also, she worked for the FDA, a government agency, so there were many, many, many paper trails for everything. And most of that material is in the Library of Congress. It's a huge, huge, huge collection. And so it was a very big project. It's funny because over the years, I've developed a relationship with Dr. Kelsey. Well, obviously, she died a couple of years ago, and her 2 daughters who have a real vested interest in this project. And it's funny, I showed them the manuscript. And the things that they wanted to censor were very funny things. Like I called her cat mangy, and they said if she wasn't a mangy cat, she's a well-loved cat. And I said, all right, we'll change it to well-loved, and that type of thing. So, yeah, I mean, the best part of it is that I had a little part in kind of reviving her. She's a person that was never really forgotten, but always forgotten in some ways, as a Canadian heroine. And so it was really great that on the day that she died, she received the Order of Canada. And I was one of the nominators. The day she died, she had moved, she was 101, and she had moved finally back to Canada to live with her daughter in London, Ontario. And she couldn't make this ceremony, so the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario came to the house, and they had a little ceremony at the house, and played a song and took pictures, and she went to sleep and slept. And that kind of is a great way to finish up a biography.
Your life. John Parascandol asked if you could say something more about her animal welfare efforts.
Okay. What she did is, as part of her role at the FDA, was when they were bringing in animal boards for ethical treatment of animals, the same time as they're bringing in the boards the ethics boards for human research. They went in tandem. They were started at the National Institute of Health, and there's always kind of an FDA NIH rivalry going on. But what she did was, you could tell when she was involved in it, in the administration of it, and starting committees and the rest of it, that she had a very good sense of when animal research was needed, when perhaps it is not needed, when the kind of animals should be, how the animals should be treated, as well as making sure that you're not doing it just for the heck of it, that that the conditions are proper, and that you're only using the number of animals, the type of species that you absolutely need. And she was very proud of it. She was very proud of the fact that both for animal research and human research, one of the controversies, and I think it was in your book there, Jackie, was the fact that she had been engaged in anti-malarial research at the prison in Joliet during the war, and so she was very proud of that research as well. And she said that it was all done very carefully and very scientifically. They had a lot of, what was interesting is they had a lot of prisoners who were involved as assistants, one of the better assistants, until he wasn't a better assistant anymore, was a man named Nathan Leopold, who some of you might remember from the Leopold and Loeb trials. And he was a very good assistant. He had been a brilliant psychopath, and he had been a science student, and he was very helpful until he thought he should take over, which I thought was kind of funny. They were upset with him, as if a psychopath should act in a certain way when he's. But anyway, so she really took her previous work to heart when it came to setting up all of these boards. And Geiling, even before the war, during the 1930s, he was very upset with research that there was an obstetrician at the University of Chicago that was doing research on pregnant women, injecting pregnant women with some kind of a drug. And when he found out about it, he was absolutely horrified, and he went to the president's office and he said, "You got to stop this kind of thing, and we have to get together all of the different medical faculties and science faculties and have some kind of protocols going," which they did. Right. So she came from a very professional background, and I think it really bore her in good stead in later years.
Okay, there's more questions. Dr. Morimoto in Japan reminds us that he has published on Francis Kelsey. I'm sure Cheryl knows about that, but Lucas encouraged him to provide links. Andrew Cow asks if you could reiterate on the intended purposes behind the experiments of Dallas Phemister.
Okay, I'd love to see Dr. Morimoto's work. Thank you. I know that Dr. Kelsey took several trips to Japan and was involved in the early days of the organization there. There was the international organization dealing with birth defects. And I know for obvious reasons, not simply because of the effects from the nuclear blast, but then later from other medical experiments that were done in Japan. So I'd love the contact information. Thank you. As far as Phemister, what he was doing was they were trying to find out how to deal with shock for the military, and the bottom line was they found out that blood transfusions helped, but it was a pretty brutal experimental project, that's for sure. The reason that it went to the city council is that with the help of William Randolph Hearst and the various humane societies at the time, it was discovered that animals, stray dogs that were not claimed, were sent free of charge to the various medical schools. But if you lost your dog and claimed it from the pound, you had to pay $8. which was a fair amount of money at this time. And so they said, this is absolutely outrageous that you can send the dogs, to get killed for nothing, but that an owner trying to save his pet has to pay money, has to pay a fine. And that's where the meeting started. And then it degenerated into a big debate over the whole notion of animal research. And all of the medical schools really went into gear and pretty well squelched any movements to pass legislation at that point. But legislation was being forwarded all over the country at different times. And so the scientists really had to stay on top of lobbying to make sure that it was not outlawed to any great extent, just regulated, basically.
There's a question from Nancy Campbell. She writes, do I recall correctly that part of both Gelling and Kelsey's pharmacological work established species difference as a salient feature? Because as pharmacologists who study opioids are aware, they might work differently in different species.
They didn't work. What they did, okay, I can give you an example in their particular research. The reason that they worked on armadillos, the original research, and worked on her first research as well, just to make it even more controversial, was she was involved in whaling operations. So one of the big moments of her life is when she was able to go as a graduate student off the coast, when she came back from Chicago, off the coast of Vancouver Island to be part of a whaling expedition. And the reason that they were doing this, and they made a film about it, and that film was used in schools, and it helped, in the long run, it helped sensitize the public to just the horrific, the whale hunt, and to start outlawing it. What they were doing was they were looking for species that had a certain type of pituitary gland. And there were certain animals that had the different strands of the gland were separate, so they were easy to take out and work on. And that's why the armadillo, the whale, they were working on certain fish, they were looking on dolphins, they went to SeaWorld, that was another thing, and this kind of thing. So cetaceans, other animals. So that they did know that certain species used, but later on, when it came to the wholesale drug research, they tended to use the same animals over and over. One thing I find really interesting with this work, and I kind of mentioned in my book, having coming out in COVID, is that we hear everything about COVID day and night, 24 hours a day, and you hear very little about the animal research involved before you go to the clinical trials. They call preclinical trials as the work with animals. There was one study that came out from the University of Saskatchewan where one of the doctors said that, yes, we've had very good results from baboons. And you don't hear that very often. You don't hear, it's almost as if they've learned too well over the years that we better not start talking too much about the species that we will be using for preclinical research, just in case we get the anti-vaxxers and everybody else will be getting up and saying that you got to stop it, we don't need a vaccine and all the rest of that. So I just find that very interesting that we seem to know everything that's going on, and yet we don't really know everything that's going on.
So, Cheryl, several people have been wanting to know, when is the book going to be out? It's all looking forward to this book.
Oh, well, thank you. It's I got it into the press a couple months ago. They're really, really happy with it. They just sent it out for a review, and pretty soon they're hoping to get it out. They want to obviously get it out with COVID, so they got to move fast because it has to do with drugs. They're hoping to get it out by the spring. One thing that I just think it's pretty funny about this, that many of you might know. Well, I don't know. Is he there, John Swan? Did he come to the conference? Do you know?
I don't know if he's in the session, didn't see his name.
Okay, well, John Swan is the FDA historian, and I had him look it over. And he said, well, I hope you're making it clear that when it comes to thalidomide, that Frances Kelsey was part of a team, that it was not a one-person job. And certainly she said it herself, and I do put that in the story, obviously. But then the press is saying, oh, we want to advertise it as the woman who saved America from, which is just such a 1960s narrative all over again. So they'll put that in the publicity, but rest assured, if you read the book, that we do bring in everybody else in the team. That's for sure.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. I think that's the end of the questions. Just to point out that in the chat, there is a link to Dr. Morimoto's work. So people can pick that up. And thank you for your usual erudition, your sense of humor, for filling in this session. And I want to thank the organizers again for arranging this great PharmaFest. Kristen, Greg, Luke, Erica, everyone, thank you so much.
Thank you, and I'm sorry that I can't see you, but thanks a lot for everything.
Bye.
Bye.